Hello everybody, my name is Dusk and welcome to another episode of Shock's video guide. In this guide I'm going to talk a little bit about how to make your units the most cost effective. And so what I mean by cost effective is that the amount of money it takes for you to make your unit should be greater than the amount of units in resources that your opponent makes that your unit kills. So basically what it means is when you go and trade units with your opponent when you're fighting with them, you basically end up spending less money on units that you have died. And so why you want to be cost effective is basically you can just assume that unless you're playing against a Zerg, which has a drastically different economy, and even so sometimes against Zergs is because their early game economies are similar to Terrans and Protosses, but you can just assume that your opponent, if they're not doing like a drastically different build, their economies are similar to yours. And so the more cost effective you can make your units are, the better you're going to get at this game. And that's just a micro tactic or just a unit decision choice that you guys are going to learn over time, which really helps you improve your game. And it's going to work against, a really aggressive play, with proxies or whatever, and it's also going to work work as a macro player, even if you're going to be defending against really aggressive play. And so the few things I want you to consider, first of all, is that Zerg economies, yeah, they're going to be really good, but Zerg also is sacrificing a lot for their economies, and if you can pressure the Zerg, it's just going to make it a little bit difficult for the Zerg player to catch up. And so that's why still a lot of players do pressure the Zerg, and it's just a common thing, basically try to catch a Zerg player off guard. But anyway, talking about units cost effectiveness, let's go over a few things that every unit's going to have. So they're going to have range, they're going to have DPS, which is a combination of their attacks, their damage, and their attack speed, and then they have their health, and then they have any kind of special abilities, and then they have their movement speed. Now all of those play a factor into the cost of the units. So let's take Zerglings for example. I'm not talking about upgrades here, so unupgraded Zerglings versus unupgraded Marines. 1v, two Zerglings versus one Marine. And Zerglings are gonna win 100% of the time, just because that's just the nature of Zerglings. They are, in low numbers, very good against Marines, and the reason being is that they're limited by surface area. Now, surface area doesn't come into play because when you're in low numbers, and so that's something you have to keep in mind, that low numbers of Zerglings are going to be better against Marines for that sole reason. Additionally, Zerglings are also going to be significantly worse than Marines in most of the cases, and if you exclude massive upgrade disparities, just because they're significantly faster. Now, think about this. Zerg has a couple units, including the Roach and I believe Banelings, Roach and Banelings, that both benefit greatly from their speed upgrade. There's a reason why you're paying that extra money for the speed upgrade. Speed is basically a valuable resource and helps you increase the DPS of your units massively. Now, because it's not a straight increase in DPS, it's not an easy calculation to figure out how much speed or how much DPS do you actually get from getting increased speed. And that's the reason why I've heard TLO say this before, but Hydralisks are useless off creep just because of their speed. They can't kite, and as a ranged unit you really want to take advantage of the fact that you can kite, and so that just makes it a little bit of an issue, especially for such an expensive unit. And that's why you don't see Hydralisks used a lot against Terran, just because they're slower, so they can't kite already. They're going to be slower than Stim Marines and Marauders, and then they can't run from them, so which means that if they ever lose an engagement, they just die, and it's just not a good thing, especially when we're all trying to make units cost effective regardless of how much economy a person has. And so let's talk about Blink Stalkers a little bit. If you think about Blink Stalkers, they have roughly 160 health. That's 80 shield, 80 armor, or 80 hull health. And if you think about that, it's kind of pretty high, but then again their damage is really, really low. Like one Stalker really is going to be able to output the damage of one Marine. I believe I've read something that a Stim Marine has almost as much DPS as a Stalker, which is incredible considering a Stalker has 125 or costs 125 minerals and 50 gas, while a Marine only costs 50 minerals. Now the main difference between the two is that the Stalkers, first of all, they move significantly faster. And then they also have the shield mechanic, and they also have the ability to blink. Now, if you just do a straight up combat between Marines, and Stalkers, Marines are going to win once they get to 7 combat shield. That's just a fact. But if you have to think about being cost effective while you're using these units. And so you have to think about the 4 factors that I listed: special abilities, their health, their range, their movement speed, and their DPS. You have to utilize all of those most cost effectively in order to get the most maximum potential out of your unit. And so what I mean by that is a Stalker is going to move faster than a Marine, and it also has significantly more health than a Marine, and has 1 more range than a Marine. And what you can do with that is basically in the early game, when Marines are pretty bad against Stalkers, you can go and bully those Marines with your single Stalker, and that's why we see that a lot in high-level Protoss versus Terran play. In fact, Protoss basically have map control up until the point where Terran, wants to get Marauders or Siege tanks, and usually, obviously, it's going to be Marauders. But Protoss gets map control in that period, and there's nothing Terran can do about it, just because of these advantages of the Stalker. Additionally, we see a lot of Blink Stalker all-ins. Now, if a Stalker goes to the front, even if it's fighting a bunker, or even if the Terran player has no bunker, and the Protoss player has Blink but doesn't use it, chances are the Protoss player is going to be able to lose, just because Stalkers do horrible DPS. They're not very tanky, even despite their 160 health. That's because they're armored, and which makes Marauders really good against them. And so that's why when you have Blink, it makes it a lot more advantageous for the Stalkers to be used. And so we see a lot of blinking into the main, blinking into the natural, picking out buildings, blinking away, and that's just abusing the mobility that your opponent doesn't have. And it's going to give you an advantage that way. So it's the same thing with Mutalisks. Mutalisks are terrible units to defend against, and I always say that. And that's just because they have low DPS, they have low health, and they have a high cost. Now, the only saving grace of the Mutalisks is that they're extremely mobile, which makes them extremely good against some races such as the Protoss for harassing. And that's just because the Mutalisks are unable to, or the Terran player is unable to respond quickly enough if you're attacking, multiple places at once. And this is true against Protoss as well. Although, because it's so common, some players have just learned to adapt. But still, it's just a very annoying thing to deal with, and it just abuses the fact that your opponent can't really respond to it correctly. And so, what I want you guys to do is think about every single unit as being equal. And I know that's like a strange concept. There's a few exceptions, such as the Carrier, the Battlecruiser, and the Reaper. But aside from that, think about every unit as being equal, and just think about it as the better units are going to cost more, and the weaker units are going to cost less. But cost-effective wise, there's no bad units besides the exceptions I listed, and that's and the main reason is that each unit has its own advantages. And so we see the Siege Tank and the Marine. They're both equally good units, but it's not like you can de facto, replace one unit with another. Late game, this is kind of not true as Terran if you go pure ghosts, but that's why they nerfed that, and so that's why we see the resurgence of Marines and Thors again. And so think about every unit as equal. Banelings cost gas, but they do a lot of burst damage, whereas Marine or Zerglings cost only emitters, but they don't do a lot of burst damage. And it's actually an interesting fact. If you're going against pure Marines and Marauders, even if you're going against pure Marauders, if you just mix in some Banelings, you're going to be able to kill them faster. And that's just because one of the weaknesses of going Zerglings. They are limited by surface area, and so when they go and try to attack, when they get up to them, they only do their one hit and then they die. Whereas Banelings, they go in and do 25 damage and it splash and then they die. And so that's why you see a lot of these varying unit compositions. They complement each other's weaknesses, and it just makes the game a lot more complex within the different races. As you can see, a Marine tank composition, for example. Marines aren't very good against Banelings, obviously, and so that's why you get the tanks to focus fire the Banelings. And Marines are pretty good against Zerglings otherwise, and medevacs and heal everything. And so that's just the stuff I want you guys to think about. Don't ever think that a specific unit is overpowered. You have to think about how their weaknesses are, what their weaknesses are, and and abuse their weaknesses. Now, granted, there are some exceptions, such as going pure Stalkers against Zerg players, but you can still counter it just by going Zerglings and Infestors. And so just it's important to keep an open mind about certain units, and not create the mentality within yourself that, oh, this unit is overpowered, I can't go against it. And so anyway, that's my little spiel. If you guys have any questions or comments, feel free to leave it in the section below. Otherwise, my name is Dusk, and I'll see you guys later.